So, hello everybody, my name is George Marchment. I am a PhD student at the University Paris-Saclay, working in collaboration with the Institut Pasteur. And today I'm going to talk about a tool that we've developed called MetroFlow. So a tool which allows us to generate interactive metro maps directly from workflow code. So I come from a bioinformatics background, and that's where I'm going to start my talk today. I'm going to start talking about the state of workflow development around 15 years ago. So back then, there were two main workflow systems which were used, so in Taverna and Galaxy. So these were GUI-based systems, so that means that users used a visual interface to develop their workflows. And back then, the user base were relatively small. There were not many people developing workflows. And within these amounts of people, there were two categories of workflow users. There was either a workflow developer, so someone who comes from a more computer science background who develops the workflows, and then a workflow user. So someone who comes from a more of a biological background who actually uses the workflows and interprets the biological results. So now if we move to workflow development today, so what has changed? So obviously there are many more workflow systems that exist. So obviously most notably Nextflow, so the reason why we're here today. Obviously there's also SnakeMake and Galaxy is still around and being used. And there are many other workflow systems which I haven't got the time to obviously mention today. So the majority of these workflow systems today now are code-based. So what has changed since 15 years ago is that now we have true bioinformaticians, so people who not only are capable of developing workflows via code, but also understand the biological significance of these workflows. And now there are many, many people developing and using these workflows. And since there's so many people using and creating these workflows, this unlocks the capability to be able to reuse existing workflows to develop new ones. So obviously there are still the workflow developers that exist and the workflow users that exist. So like people who build the workflows and then the people who uses them. However, the border between the two is a bit more unclear. Is when we're more on a spectrum of users now, where there are people who might want to develop their workflows, but at the same time want to look at the biological significance of other workflows. And then on the opposite end of the spectrum, we have workflow users who use workflows, but at the same time maybe want to adapt their existing workflows by taking parts from the other side. In any case, all the different types of users which exist on the spectrum want to gain better insight into other workflows to be able to reuse them. So now the question we can ask ourselves is, okay, well, how do they actually do this? How do they gain insight into workflows? Typically, users could use documentation of the workflow. This is the element which describes the workflow's functionality. So here I've given the README. And of course, since workflows are a set of steps which are interconnected together, one way to represent workflows, and we find very often documentation, are graphical representations. And more specifically, so I've represented the metro maps here given by the NFCO community. So why am I talking about these? Well, I think that I find these representations really, really good. They're so useful. They're very easy to read. They give a big overview of the functionalities of the workflow, so without actually having looking into all the thousands of lines of code of the workflow. And they're great to share and to allow others to reuse the workflow. So obviously these metro maps are hand-drawn. And that comes with this, the fact that they're hand-drawn. Obviously, it's not all perfect. There are some limitations to the hand-drawn aspects. So this is what I'm going to touch upon a bit now. For one is that obviously since these are hand-drawn representations, is that we can have very many different types of representations. So in the first slide I represented only the metro maps representation, but we can also have other different types of representations that exist. And on top of that, within representations of the same type, we may have the same visual aspects may not be representing the same information within the workflow themselves. So this is another layer of difficulty to understand the workflow. And obviously, since workflows are very large and very complex, there has to be arbitrary simplification choices to reduce the complexity. This is normal. However, depending on the user, they might not make the same choices. So again, this adds another layer of difficulty. Another limitation is that, well, there's no mirroring between the workflow implementation and then the metro map or the representation. What I mean by this is that imagine when we draw up the representation on the metro map. So we finish the workflow, we publish it, we share it, it's excellent. What happens a couple of weeks later, a couple of months later, where we have to update the workflow to add a functionality, or perhaps we remove an old functionality? Well, the Metro map still has to be updated. It's in its old state. So we can't expect the developers to take time to do this every time because the Metro maps take a long time to draw up. So obviously there's a lack of synchronization sometimes between the representation and the workflow themselves. And then the final limitation, and this might be me nitpicking, but since they are representations, they are drawings, they are images, they are static, which means that users can't really interact or can't explore the workflow code directly from these Metro maps. So obviously this is a limitation because it forces the user to have to search through the code themselves. So obviously it's very easy for me to criticize these representations and say, well, this is not ideal, whatever. So what would we want in a perfect world? Well, I guess what I would like, at least, since I'm such a fan of Metro maps, is that I think I'd like a system that would automatically generate the Metro maps from the workflow code. So that means the user gives their workflow, the current implementation, and it gives as an output the Metro map. And then what would be ideal is that this Metro map could be interactive. So that means that the user can explore certain parts of the representation, zooming and de-zooming, and have the capability to actually explore the code of the workflow, so by actually viewing the code itself. Well, this is the question I asked myself about a year ago. I drew up a to-do list and I was like, okay, what do I need to actually access this? Well, for one, you need to be able to analyze the workflow code. We need to be able to extract its structure. So that means all the different steps and how these steps are connected together. And we also need a way to generate the interactive Metro map. So this is what I did. I first started developing a tool called BioFlow Insights, which was published last year, which analyzes the code of Nextflow workflows, and it does many things. But most notably, it reconstructs the structure of the workflow without actually executing it. So that means that we take the workflow code, we look at it in its ensemble, and we can actually extract the structures. So that's great. Now we can remove the first thing off our to-do list. We can extract the structure of the workflow. And again, since we extract the entirety of the workflow, we have a view of the whole workflow, we can do many other things. So for one, we can see errors which are possibly in the code. So we can detect many different types of errors. So for example, here I've just given one example of a process call which wasn't given the right number of parameters. And here we can say, okay, well, in this file, on this line of code, this call has not given the right number of parameters. Another functionality that we are capable of doing is to generate the row create file, which describes all the workflow's functionality and the metadata associated. Since BioFlow Insight analyzes the code directly from GitHub, we can extract all the metadata from GitHub. And what this allows us to do is to automatically add workflows to Workflow Hub, so through the row create file. So this is work which we are currently which is in progress with Carol Gobble's team in Manchester. So I've recently had the opportunity to work with them on this topic. So a big thank you to them. And since last year, so since the first publication, I've also added new functionalities. So most notably, the ability to extract conditions from the workflow themselves. So as we know, when we develop a workflow, we might want to take different paths depending on different conditions. So this is what I can extract now. So for example, here, when we have condition A is true, we can go from process 1 to P2, and when it's false, we go from process 1 to P3. So this information I can now extract directly from the workflow code. So that's the first thing I needed to do off the to-do list. I can analyze the code. So what's remaining now? I can analyze the workflow code, I can extract its structure, and now I need to be able to generate the interactive Metro map. Well, I guess my presentation wouldn't be very interesting if I wasn't able to do that. So the good news is that we've also worked on a new tool called MetroFlow, which now, so using what we can extract from BioFlow Insights, generates a Metro map directly from the workflow code. So for any Nextflow workflows. So on top of that, this representation is done in a homogeneous way, where we represent all the different sub-workflows which are defined in the workflow, the processes, and as I said, the conditions for the different paths. So we represent these through colors. So I'll talk about this later. And the cherry on top is that not only we can generate these Metro maps, but we can also explore them. We can visualize the workflow codes directly through the interface. And we also can change the view of the Metro map to really explore the different elements of the workflow. So this is what I'm going to show you next in the demo. So as I said, MetroFlow can automatically generate metro maps for Nextflow workflows. And on top of that, so in a homogeneous way, so representing the same information in the same way. So in this demo, I'm more going to focus on the interactive and the code exploration side of MetroFlow. So I'm first going to focus on the code exploration by visualizing the processes directly through the interface. So here what I'm going to do is select the genome annotation process to see its code. So this window pops up, which shows the entirety of the process code. So where a user can see which tool is used, for example. And the same way this can be done for all the processes. Then I said that each color of the edge or each color edge represents a condition. So the conditions can also be visualized in the same way. So here I'm going to select a red color edge to see which condition it represents. So now let's focus on the interactive side of the metro map. So by focusing on the hiding and minimizing of processes. So by hiding a process, the node and all its adjacent edges are removed from the metro map. So here I'm going to remove the index spam process, and it also removes all its adjacent all its adjacent edges. And to put it back, we just have to do Ctrl-Z. Now let's say I want to hide a node without completely removing it. Then this is what I've done here. I can minimize a node by making it smaller and by hiding its title. So here I've hidden the mapping process. The next simplification functionality I want to talk about is the ability to collapse subworkflows. So this is done by replacing the subworkflow area and all its processes by a single node. So which is what I've done here for quality control and download files. So hence making the representation a lot simpler. So to uncollapse them, we just have to double click. And finally, the last functionality is the ability to focus on a subworkflow by viewing it in total isolation of the rest of the workflow. So here I'm going to select the download files subworkflow to view it in isolation. So by doing this, I only see the processes and the other subworkflows which compose it. So this allows to fully explore even the most complex of workflows. And just to give you a comparison of what we can generate compared to what exists in reality. So on the left, we have the representation, which is given by the NF-core ISOSEC metro map, which is hand-drawn. And then on the right, the one which can generate automatically from MetroFlow. So obviously here we can see that the structures are completely identical. And obviously the image from MetroFlow can be exported and the image can then be touched upon. So we can also add, if we want to, the file information in the same way as the one on the left. So just to conclude, so if I'm returning back to my original motivation when I was talking about the different types of users, we have workflow developers who develop workflows by taking over workflows and readapting them, and then workflow users who want to add to their existing workflows, and all the different types of users which exist in between. In any case, they all want to gain insight into workflows, and with MetroFlow, they can do this. They can explore the different views and the code of the workflows to be able to reuse workflows in an easier way. So to do this, just as a summary, so MetroFlow allows to automatically generate metro maps directly from workflow code. They're represented in a homogeneous way, and it allows users to interact with the metro map and also explore the workflow code. So obviously a big thank you to my collaborators, and that concludes my talk. Thank you so much for listening to me.